Everything good? Yeah. All right, welcome. I'm Allison Ormsby, a lecturer in environmental studies and interim co-director of sustainability for UNC Asheville. Welcome to the keynote speaker for this fall's Greenfest. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank the many people and organizations that made this event possible. Thanks to all the staff, and especially to campus operations for helping with the setup of this room, communications and marketing for setting up the live feed on YouTube, our tech support to make it possible for us to enjoy the Bluegrass Band, and the fabulous Bluegrass musicians, and conductor Wayne Erbson, who we just enjoyed in the reception. So thanks to everybody. I also want to thank our community partner organizations for the informative tables in our pre-reception. And they're still here, so if you want to chat with them after the event, you can, and sign up for their newsletters and follow them. I hope you all enjoyed learning about these organizations, including the Campus Student Environmental Center and the Campus Student Run Gardens. Thanks to Chartwell's dining services for the yummy, locally sourced snacks that we enjoyed. They're still there for some more eating. And a special shout out to the Hop for making us a delicious Paw vegan ice cream for this event especially. Yes. As you may know, we usually hold a fall farm-to-table dinner. Last year we had to cancel the dinner. We were already in conversation with Marc Williams to be our keynote speaker for the dinner last year. So I want to thank Marc, as well as the many, many people on the planning committee, many of whom are here tonight, and especially my co-director, Jackie Hampstead, for adapting this event many times over the past 2 years. Again, we had to cancel the farm-to-table dinner event this year, but we have reimagined it into this event tonight. We hope to hold the in-person dinner next year, and that you will be able to join us. Please follow the UNC Asheville Office of Sustainability on Facebook and Instagram to be able to get all of the updates about our future events. Thanks to all of you joining us via live stream from all around the world. If you have questions for Marc, you can enter them in the chat area online, and I will monitor them. I've gathered some pre-prepared questions for Marc from UNC Asheville students. We will not have a formal question and answer session at the end of the talk to try to be as COVID safe as possible and to hold our event to about 1 hour. Of course, we have the tables, and you can informally chat after the event. So now, to introduce Marc. Marc Williams is the first person I met upon moving to Asheville. And I want to thank Susan Leopold of the plant conservation organization United Plant Savers for introducing me to Marc. Marc is an ethnobiologist or ethnobotanist, which means that he studies people, plant, mushroom, and microbe interactions. Marc's academic training includes an undergraduate degree in environmental studies and sustainable agriculture from our neighbor, Warren Wilson College, and a master's degree in Appalachian Studies and Sustainable Development from Appalachian State University. If you're local and you've gone on a foraging walk or attended the annual permaculture gathering, you probably already know Marc. Marc has taught thousands of students about nature, people, and their interface, including online at the website Botany Every Day. Botany Every Day. Great. And he's currently a board member of the organization United Plant Savers. And you can learn more about his past work and current work at the website plantsandhealers.org. So we look forward to learning from Marc tonight. Please join me in welcoming Marc Williams.
All right. Maybe is that good? Didn't feel very microphoned. Didn't think about that, the difference in height. There we go. Okay, howdy folks. So excited to be here, super duper grateful. And this is really something that has been gestating, growing inside of me for quite a while, like a couple decades. Because literally this iconography there that says Field to Fork, that is a lecture series that I and one of my great mentors and teachers in the audience, Michael Gentry, helped put on at Warren Wilson College when I was an undergrad there. And when we were thinking about what would the title for this talk be, that kind of bubbled up to the surface again. But this is the first time I've given this talk, and I've given hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of talks. So I'm really excited to bring some new material and incorporate some old material into that, and to be here for the Greenfest and to celebrate all of those things that are sustainable related to life on Earth. So we talked a little bit about me already, this idea of ethnology, study of human culture, biology, the study of life forms, ethnobiology, combining human culture with life forms. Part of my experience along those lines has been to travel a lot to 30 countries, all 50 states in the USA, and look at the life forms, learn from the people that are interacting with them, and bring that to fruition here with you. Also working locally with over 100 different organizations. So it's something that is, as Al mentioned, it's very much woven into the fabric of my time here in the community over the last couple decades. To represent for my family and my heritage, on one side I am Dutch, and I have my folks, Jan and Sini Cole, right there on a hike in this area. And then on the other side I am African American, and there's my dad with his wife Grace to the left and her mom to the right. And it really is intrinsic to what I'm sharing with you, this idea of this legacy, in particular coming from my dad's side, in that there's really this history that everybody will be at least somewhat familiar with, but me more directly, around slavery, around Jim Crow, around bad things happening in the field, right, in historic times. And at the same time, I was basically raised to be an officer in the military, definitely not get dirty, at least like have something that gave me lots of benefits and kind of white collar style. And it's interesting to be here now 20 years later, kind of putting those two things together. But one thing I would say is that whether it's from my own family and that lineage, and certainly in the Dutch side, it's kind of similar. Both of them were bankers. You know, it's like, let's get out of the field. You know, it's been interesting to reclaim the beauty that's there. Yes, it's hard work. Yes, it might not make you a ton of money, but there's something that it makes you in your heart and your soul that certainly goes way beyond money, that I'm so grateful that I found this as a path. And I think I've got this bottle on display here in the middle, and this kind of incarnate an example of what I'm talking about with Field to Fork. So that bottle is from this over 600-year-old town in Holland where my folks lived up until recently. There's a little church on the label that my great-grandpa helped build. And it really is like this idea of the liqueur of this town, right? It's like messages in a bottle is the way I would say it too, of like really taking the sense of place to the container, to the label, let alone the ingredients that are inside. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in lots of different ways as we go forward. Really fundamentally understanding this idea of whether it's botany or mycology, plants, mushrooms, or other things by the family grouping associations they're part of, how this plays out with wild edibles, with exotic invasives, with lots of different forms of cultivated plants, animals, mushrooms, microbes, and some great organizations doing awesome work. Here we've got some examples of exotic invasive at times, wild edible like dandelion. We've got heirloom vegetable that's often forgotten, good King Henry, kind of related to spinach and lamb's quarters. You've got heirloom types of things that everybody's familiar with, like potatoes, but in purple. And then you've got something like yakan, which is an amazing plant that comes to us from South America that people do cultivate here locally and do awesome, amazing things with, as well as some examples. So this idea of families is really huge, and I know some of you will be familiar with this, right? But every single organism has a scientific name, genus, species, right? The general name, the specific name. The next level above that is the family. okay? Oftentimes by knowing what family plant or mushroom is in, you can know all these amazing things about it. Is it edible? Is it medicinal? Is it poisonous? Is it good for birds and bees and butterflies? Is it potentially exotic invasive? Can it potentially help clean up the environment? All sorts of different functions that happen at the family level. And the thing is, there's a lot fewer families than there are genera or species, right? You can see 2,400 species, 700 genera, and about 170 families just in this area. But the vast majority of plants you might be interested in, especially for food or medicine, would fit into about 30 families. And a lot of you would be familiar with some of those already, like the mustard family or the rose family or the mint family, these kinds of things. I would say also that part of Botany Every Day, right, this book is Botany in a Day, and that's a textbook for an online class that I inherited from one of my greatest teachers, influences, and mentors, Frank Cook. He taught it for 9 years, I've taught it for 12 years now at the Botany Every Day website, and we basically go through all these different categories and a bunch of others through the process of that class that's taught totally by donation. So there is this real important piece around the family trends, right? So there's a major family everybody would be familiar with. I call it the celery family. Some people might call it the carrot family. Lots of foods in there that we cultivate, even some really great foods from the wild, calling in sweet cicely, honewort, angelica, wild cilantro as some examples. But at the same time, this family has some of the most poisonous plants in the whole entire world. Right? And so it's really important to learn these rules, should you care to, and be motivated, if you're not already, by the end of this talk. But at the same time, you need to know those exceptions to the rules as well, right? That's really important. And even some of the members of this family, even some that could be edible, could still cause some pain externally from the sap. So lots of, as I think of, actually Dr. John Brock is a professor now, but he was my professor as at Warren Wilson. One of the biggest catchphrases I learned from him there was that the devil is in the details. All right, so details are important. There are a ton of wild edibles in the US, right? About 4,000 species. At the same time, most of the food in the whole world comes from just about 30, largely corn, wheat, rice, and soy. Huge percentage, just those four, right? There's this amazing book, Encyclopedia of Edible Plants in North America, that lists all those thousands. If you're interested, having good books like that, this is one of the best field guides for the wildflowers at the top by the authors Horn and Cathcart. Very important. And the scientific names can also be important because, for instance, there's a tree called hemlock that might be edible versus the poison hemlock I was just talking about from the carrot family, which is very different families. Knowing these toxic plants, which are relatively few, or toxic mushrooms, which we'll talk about a little bit as well, is really important. Then it can kind of free you up because the vast majority are kind of neutral to good, and it's a relatively small minority that could hurt you. Also knowing this idea of how to prepare the plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there's all different forms of ways that you could be making these into deliciousness, as we have as an example over there at the snack table. Really what's intrinsic to so much of this work for me is this idea of including ethics, and Allison's already called in this organization, United Plant Savers, that I'm on the board of. They have a group of sanctuaries across the country and even other parts of the world that save medicinal plants, in particular the seeds of these medicinal plants. Of course, one of the really famous local wild edibles of our area are the ramps, but it's kind of become a perennial issue as far as sustainability with the ramps. At the same time, I'm sure a lot of people would be familiar with this idea of wild onions, like you're mowing your lawn and all of a sudden everything smells like onions, right? They look kind of like chives, basically. So looking at things like this as an example of using, say, these other wild onions that are actually sometimes exotic invasive versus these really special wild onions that are potentially threatened is a big part of my work, and certainly a part of United Plant Savers as well. Really thinking about when you're harvesting too, right, that you want to leave some for other people, but also for other animals, but also for the plants or the fungi or whatever to be able to reproduce themselves as well. And there's no hard, fast things. Like some people say, 10% or something, or every fifth one, or that's going to vary by plant. And certainly fungi are a whole different issue. But here we've got the ramps in the bottom right, and then to the left of that, those are the flowers. And kind of connecting the dots, well, if you're going to be taking the ramps, what can you give the ramps? Like coming back once those flowers become seeds and planting those seeds, right? Or propagating the ones that you find like in stores or something that still have the roots on them, which we're kind of trying to move away from. But beyond anything, giving thanks, I feel like, if nothing else, right? It's really important, and you see this embedded within many indigenous cultures all over the world, is that we need to have a cyclical connection to nature, right? It's not just an extractive taking kind of connection. It's like, well, where's the reciprocity? Where can we give back? And if we can't give anything, we can at least give thanks. Thinking about the rules of wild edibles, I would say it's really important to understand all of this minutia. Like I said, the devil being in the details. I think of it as being a reporter and trying to get the whole story, right? The who, the what, the why, the how, the when, the where, right? So knowing what part to use, when to harvest, where to harvest, in particular in urban spaces, along roadsides, train tracks, but also out in the country, it could be an issue of chemical intensivity, pretty kind of obvious in urban space, but say like out in the country, we used to put lead in paint, right? We actually used to spray lead arsenic on apples as a pesticide, right? So you could be out in some old-timey place and be like, oh, yeah, this is pristine, nobody's done anything here forever. Well, metals have no memory, they just stay there forever. And it's been shown that some things that are harvested traditionally in orchards, for instance, like morels, can take up things like these heavy metals, right? So similarly in ornamental type places that are heavily intensively managed, also florists, these could be items that even though technically they might be edible, they might have compounds that are not even listed for food, and I have enough issues with the ones that they put on food, but let alone the ornamental ones, right? But using all of your senses is really huge, learning this kind of thing. Learning in person with experts as well is a good way to do that, so then you have your sense of touch, you have your sense of smell, taste. This is gonna wire your mind in a whole different, deeper way, getting into that kind of primal mind, especially the smell sense goes way back. And thinking about incorporating that anytime you have the opportunity to be out and about looking for things to consume, like this beautiful spice bush that looks pretty much just like this right now, right? This is our native version of, say, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, right? This is the thing that I would use to make candies and cookies and cakes, for the holidays. Also makes a really delicious tea. But there's really a ton of diversity out there, right? About 4,000 things for North America, well over 300 things just for our area. And out of those 170 families that I mentioned, you could distill down the wild edibles into this few handfuls of families, all right? And as I mentioned some of them already, you'll recognize some of the common names that go along with those families. And I think I'm gonna leave it at that and just kind of get into some specific examples. So here we've got wild greens, for instance, right? And here, these are wild onions and another exotic invasive that's up on the top left called henbit, Lamium plexicale. And that's actually bouquet that I gave to a friend for her birthday, right? So there's this idea of eating with your mouth, right? But then there's the idea of eating with your eyes, right? And there's this idea of feeding yourself for nutrients, for minerals, for vitamins, but there's this idea of feeding yourself or your family with beauty that's its own form of the field coming into, right? Wild mustards are gonna be one of the biggest ones all over the world, anywhere it gets cold in the middle there. Some people might be familiar with the folk vernacular term around here, creasy greens, right, for those, which is like just this great ritual in the spring to go out when the fresh vegetables are available, when, especially in olden times, you didn't really have access to that all winter long. right? We've got pigweed, also known as callaloo in places more tropical than this, but also known as amaranth, right? That probably most of you have heard of now. Superfood, right? In the bulk bins at the natural food store, all this stuff. At the same time, more poison than probably almost any crop in the world other than cotton, because the farmers of the Midwest and other places that grow corn and soy see this as this terrible thing, right? Whereas there's this whole book from the 70s where a lot of my favorite books come from that says amaranth, food for the future. Well, I guarantee you we could do a whole talk on amaranth. It's still the food for the future, even though we're poisoning it. And if you can find good organic examples of it, then it's one of the grains that has all 8 essential amino acids. Makes a complete protein, unlike most of the other grains in the grass family. Stinging nettles, some people would be familiar with. Lamb's quarters, a particular purple variety called magenta green. Spanish needles, also known by a lot of different names. And wood sorrel is one, in my travels, that's one that like the kids love, just wherever I go, whether it's Jamaica or Costa Rica or you name it, Europe, North America, people are going to be loving this wood sorrel for that sour taste that it brings, right? So those are some examples of the greens. And then we've got the fruit, right? We've got one of these fruits featured in the ice cream, woo-woo! In the middle there, the pawpaw, right? That's the largest native fruit consumed by people in North America, right? Then you've got the persimmon, another one coming up right now at the top right there. And that's a big part of my work, is bringing in more persimmons, more pawpaws. I was talking with Justin and the Nutty Buddy collective back there about how we have so much potential for all of these really awesome improved cultivars. In the case of the pawpaw, like big like mangoes instead of the wild ones, small like golf balls. You know, similarly with the persimmons, they might be as big as a quarter in the wild, but cultivated ones can be much bigger. But we have plums, we have black raspberries, and lots of other things related to black raspberries, right? Red raspberries, blackberries, these kinds of things. And of course, we've got the oak. That's a very special oak. If you could think of the ratio, that thing's like almost 2 inches wide. That's the biggest acorn, or at least one of them in the world, that actually grows native in Costa Rica, but we have a ton of amazing oaks here. So I really want to represent for the Cherokee, the main indigenous group of this area, and the fact that we are on their traditional land that has this huge legacy of field to fork, right? In so many amazing different ways. There are some current teachers like Amy Walker, Mary Crow, and Tyson Sampson, who I've actually been fortunate to participate in learning from on this campus, but also in other places in the community. There are some early foraging staples to put out there, like chestnut, walnut, hickory, and acorns for indigenous people, certainly here locally, the Cherokee, but also across North America, and for that matter, in the case of especially things like acorns and chestnuts across the world where it's cold. Amazing native greens like Sochani, Rudbeckia laciniata, and poke. I think it bears mentioning with poke that it is something that can be tricky, especially in that it's often called poke salad or poke salad, once again in the mountain vernacular. And that does not mean go like you do to the grocery store, get your mescaline mix, your goddess dressing, and nice raw salad. No. Not going to be good, right? So this is a whole different thing that takes a lot more processing, a lot more cooking, a lot of different recipes as far as that goes. Also very important when you're going to harvest. Typically it's harvested in the spring as a kind of ritual meal as part of spring detoxification process. And it's really just these early greens that are the main thing that are going to be consumed, although there is a lot of fame in using it medicinally and using other parts. But definitely some devils in those details if you don't pay attention and be humble. So of course, fruits we would be familiar with as well. Some I didn't mention, like sumac, strawberry, and passion fruit. It's interesting, like coming across in my graduate research about passion fruit, it was called field apricot, right? And so that kind of just gets into this idea of the mountain knowledge. And oftentimes I say when a plant has a lot of common names, that means it's been important to a lot of common people, right? If you see that again and again. Of course, passion fruit is famous wherever it is. But people would often think of it more like the fruit and like the juice, but actually there's a tradition of even using it like a vegetable as well, and certainly using it medicinally for that matter too. I didn't find a lot of information about wild edible mushrooms in my research, although I know it's bigger than this list. Hen of the Woods is one that came up pretty big, that's actually coming up out of the ground off of primarily red oak trees locally right now. Good one to learn about. Speaking to the agriculture side of things, a lot of people will be familiar with the three sisters, the corn, the beans, the squash, but that's actually a pretty recent download, actually mostly from the desert Southwest, especially in regards to the corn and the beans. There's some debate about squash being independently domesticated in a number of other places. Less people familiar with this Eastern agricultural complex that I haven't seen tied directly to the Cherokee, but just across the mountains over in Kentucky, there's this history of indigenous use of things like Jerusalem artichokes, a type of sunflower. Also things that foragers will recognize, like a type of lamb's quarters, a type of smartweed. And a little bit more obscure would be this plant sumpweed, which is in the aster family, for any geeks out there, look that up. But I would mention also this idea that's so much beyond, once again, the field to the fork in the way of, okay, now I'm getting my iron, now I'm getting my vitamin C. It's like, well, what's your spiritual food, right? And so around the fall, there still is, a green corn ceremony to give thanks for the corn that's coming in, that's going to sustain life. Of course, so many beautiful varieties of corn. This is from my alma mater there at Warren Wilson. I think the red one's called Bloody Butcher in particular, quite the evocative name. And thinking of corn and this idea of nutrition, right? And this tradition of taking corn and making it into hominy. How many people are familiar with hominy and what makes hominy hominy? So we have a pretty advanced audience here, maybe about half of the folks. So raising the pH, typically you would be adding wood ash while you're cooking the corn, turns into hominy, which also turns into complete protein. Brilliant, right? This is way before we knew about these kinds of things and the matter of the science that people are studying in the chemistry labs here on campus, right? But indigenous people had the brilliance to figure these things out. And then there's this beverage made from the hominy called ganahena in the Cherokee tradition, which is also consumed in a ritual manner at times, I understand. So that's a bit about those folks, and gosh, I just feel so humbled to be on this land and in this place. Of all my travels to all those 30 countries and 50 states, this is my favorite place I've ever been. And I just feel so grateful to be able to share in its beauty with all of you, and certainly with the indigenous people that have been here long before most, if not all of us. So thinking about the idea of cultivating vegetables more big picture, you've got things people might be familiar with, like biodynamics, kind of like organic plus, biointensive. Think of John Jevons is really the man for that, top right there. Gave a workshop at Warren Wilson many moons ago. And I brought in the farming while black piece. It's not exactly as much a philosophy as much as it is something that is really needing this reclaiming. I mean, I kind of alluded to it in my own family history about moving off the farm and out of the field, right? That's the last thing you're supposed to be doing. But leaving behind all the beauty, right? So there's this place, Soulfire Farm in New York, that one of the leaders there, Leah Penniman, has written this book, Farming While Black, so anybody interested in that, that's a really great resource. I would also mention, just while I'm thinking about it, Alexis Nicole Nelson, maybe some people are familiar with her, amazing, goes by the Black Forager, and also, yeah, I've got so many resources, I would say, but those are a couple that come to mind. I guess Michael Twitty is the other one that I wanted to say, who wrote this incredible book, The Cooking Gene, about the traditions of African Americans, and in particular, like taking it before the slave times, right? We're talking about back in Africa with the Akan and with the Igbo and with the Mandinka and with the Mende and all of these incredible traditions that are still practiced on the continent and could be reclaimed here. But moving on, we've got things like square foot gardening, lasagna gardening. These are especially intensive for small areas. Permaculture really changed my life, maybe close to 24 years ago or so now. A term that kind of came out of Australia, a guy named Bill Mollison in particular really popularized it. David Holmgren was kind of a co-creator. And it basically means making your culture permanent, right? And at the same time, a joke within the realm, this came out in the 70s, so the joke is it's like a 40-some-year-old term for a 10,000-year-old idea, right? It's really honoring the indigenous heritage of people from all over the world. And then speaking of the honoring piece, you've got me with Wendell Berry there at a conference, incredible wordsmith around these things, especially in poetry. Barbara Kingsolver, who did the Eat Local diet. Animal Vegetable Miracles, the book that came from that, Michael Pollan. These are some people you may already recognize. If you don't, I highly encourage you to look them up. And other publishers like Chelsea Green and Rodale are some of my favorites. And then you've got classes through Cooperative Extension, Living Web Farms, which is local, and Wild Abundance, which is also local as far as learning some of these great skills. Now, this is a really hard slide for me to present, and I imagine it could be a hard slide for y'all to take in. And I know that I promised all the good connections between people, plants, mushrooms, microbes, and the universe, right? But at the same time, I would be remiss if I wasn't keeping it real with some of the challenges that are inherent with our current food system, right? So we got almonds. Most almonds in the world come from California, where I was born, literally just hours away from where I was born. Some reports say up to 1 gallon of water per almond, okay, it takes. And that's not just your regular water, right? This is growing in a desert, right? So oftentimes we're literally mining that water from ancient fossil water in the ground that will never be recharged, right? Let alone the thousands of miles that come over here. I would say with all of these things too, I was putting in every slide the pesticide piece, right? If they're not organic, there's just some really sad things going on. And avocados is an interesting, more recent story, right? Really the last decade, they've exploded with the guacamole and all these things. Most of the avocados for the whole country come from this one part of Mexico, Michoacan, and there is incredible gang violence around avocados of all things, right? And there's an amazing documentary on Netflix if you really want to inform yourself. But these are the stories in the field, you know, before it gets to your fork. And we got to connect these dots, right? I mean, it's one thing if it tastes good in a physical sense, but when there's all of this behind it, bananas, pretty much anywhere I've been where they're growing bananas, there's like some really poor working conditions. And often now more and more we're looking at this threat to bananas as a whole industry because of a disease that's coming and taking out the bananas, because pretty much almost all the bananas in the world are one clone variety of banana. What could go wrong, right? Okay, so chocolate. This is the one that's closest to my heart, and it's kind of the one of all these that I would be hard pressed to do without. And you know, I'm talking about my history, you know, of the African American side, and my dad literally grew up hearing stories of the enslaved from his elders. You know, we can kind of think, oh, this is like a long time ago. My dad's 83, and so yeah, but this isn't this is now in Africa. You know, for conventional chocolate, there are little kids that are picking that stuff for your Valentine's, for your Halloween that's coming up, for that special birthday. And I'm here to say that, like, it might taste sweet on the plate going into your mouth, but knowing that cost, that toll that's behind it, I just pretty much, obviously there are solutions and answers I'm going to talk more about. The fair trade organic is the short of the long of it. If we're talking about things like chocolate, we're talking about things like coffee. Really hard times, coffee goes up as this bulk commodity, and people have these boom and bust cycles. That happens a lot in farming and other realms as well. And then with climate change, coffee can only grow in a very small area of the world, then pretty much all those places are probably going to have to switch over time. And then sugarcane, oh my gosh. This one really does just go into the depths of the darkness of agriculture. And thankfully, a lot of it is harvested by machines now, but the stuff that's still harvested by hand, and I just listened to just profound podcast reveal through NPR about the Haitian sugarcane farmers in the Dominican Republic and the things that they're facing to this day. So these are obviously major foods, right, that pretty much all of us have loved, probably, at least the majority of them at some point in our life. And I would just say that that extra amount to get it into the organic fair trade is way worth it if you're talking about this complete holistic idea of taking it from the field to the fork in a sustainable manner. All right, we're going to go back to the beauty now and talk about some heirlooms, right? So heirlooms is this idea that whether it's tomatoes or potatoes or peppers or corn, that instead of like apples would be one I've spent a lot of my time, decades of my life on, right? And you go into the grocery store and it's the red one, the yellow one, the green one, and the other red one, right? And then maybe the pink one, right? But I'm here to tell you there are like over 15,000 varieties of apples in the 1800s. There's still hundreds of varieties here in Appalachia. Appalachia is maybe the most diverse place for apples in North America and definitely one of the most diverse in the world. And there are very few people that are holding that light up. I think of Big Horse Creek Farm in particular, I think have the largest variety. But you have some other places too, like Cornell is like the national depository, for instance. But that could be the story with all these things, hundreds of kinds of tomatoes, hundreds of kinds of peppers, even things that are more obscure now like beets, right? So going local with the seeds, So True's our most local. Southern Exposures just up the road in Virginia. Johnny's and Fedco have some of the best prices and selection. They're up in Maine. And at the same time, you have this more informal network of seed exchanges and the nonprofit Southern Seed Legacy that speaks to some of these things too. So really want to just put a big plug in for this concept of cut and come again. It basically has to do with vegetables that you can cut and then they grow back. Like, amazing, right? And gosh, I was just so tickled this year, in particular in my garden at home, planting parsley in the winter, and I'm still getting parsley now, probably through the winter. You know, I'm probably gonna get like a year's worth of parsley, just cut and come again, cut and come again. But you could do that with the related cilantro, other things like Swiss chard, kale, lettuce, spinach. Some beautiful pictures, once again, from Warren Wilson, and a way of really planting those greens intensively as well to get the most bang for your buck. Of course, that was one of the classic things. When I was at Warren Wilson, my whole focus was how do we get more local food and ideally from the campus into the food system, right? But it's the reverse calendar-wise, right? That like when most of the food is bumping, that's when the students are on break, you know, and then the students come back just as like the season's winding down. So greens is a big one because you can grow those through the winter, especially with cover. But also putting up things, preserving them would be another big one. So then we've got, of course, all sorts of fruits. I've talked about some of these already. I definitely want to represent for Michael Gentry once again here with the idea of eating dogwoods. This is actually a platter in the middle on the right that he put together at the permaculture gathering that Allison mentioned that happens the first week of August every year. And that's got these, what are called Cornelian cherries. They're kind of dogwood that you could find growing both on campus here and also in some of the local food forests. Yeah, autumn olive, I'm going to get more into exotic invasives, but that is one of the big exotic invasives coming on right now in the bottom left there. And yeah, cherries, crab apples, pears, persimmons, right? Waiting until your persimmons look like this, kind of mushy and wrinkly, is more ideal than like picking them off the tree right when they're way too astringent. I only have to learn that lesson typically once. More great education through the Organic Grower School, which used to be hosted here. I think now it's moved to Mars Hill University. There's a Master Pomologist program, which is one of only 2 programs in the whole country that is in Hendersonville. Pomology is the science of specifically growing fruit. So that's something to be aware of through cooperative extension. And then the Nutty Buddies represent back there with all of their cool stuff, making the oils and the meats and all of these great things. Also lots of scion, switching and maintaining some of these orchards. So really this slide's all about this concept that I mentioned already, this eating with your eyes as well as your mouth, that beauty is its own form of nourishment, right? So if I'm ever doing especially like like an event like this, right? Or, somebody's birthday or anniversary or something, I'm always gonna try to step it up, with some beautiful flowers. All of these being things that you can find locally. The begonias, actually we do have some hardy begonias you can keep outside, but they're more of a house plant. That a lot fewer people are aware of its ability probably than some of these other ones. But you can really see this at the top left there with how far you can go, right? Different colored chips, different colored carrots, different colored flowers, all together to make one beautiful thing. Speaking to animals, I do want to say that I've been vegetarian since 1997, and this is the one slide I have on animals. Of course, that's its whole own realm of field to forkism and agriculture. And I would just say, where these pictures were taken are a huge array apart from where most of the animal food comes from, right? And so if we are going to be consuming animals, I would say really where they're coming from, right? This idea of you are what you eat, right? So if the animals have, as Joel Salatin says, a great life until that one last day, versus just like suffering their whole entire existence before they make it to you, I would argue that that's a big difference. Now at the same time, I know there's like people that are super hyper anti-animal consumption, and like I said, I'm vegetarian. But I would push back at least to some degree and say if you have this vegan diet that's only, really focused on corn and soy, and especially if you got the vegan but not the organic one, then it's coming from thousands of miles away and grown intensively in an unsustainable manner. Then local animals grown with love, I would say that's more sustainable, even as a vegetarian. I'm just keeping it real from my perspective. Please don't hate on me. I'm happy to dialogue in a healthy and productive manner as far as that stuff goes. Moving on to mushrooms. Mushrooms are actually closer to animals than they are to plants, interestingly enough. And that's why they're such a good source of protein, for one. If you are going to be selling mushrooms, there is a certification process that you need to go through, just to be aware of that. Some of my teachers are Alan Muscat, Alan and Arlene Bissett, Ken Krause, and Mateo Rial. Got Ken Krause up there in the top left doing an incredible thing I was able to do with Living Web Farms, along with him and another great teacher and mentor, Doug Elliott, featuring all these incredible mushrooms that are available. Some that I don't even have on this list. What I have on this list are the main varieties that I've been taught to focus on, and I focused on for the better part of 15 years before I kind of launched into this realm with the mushrooms like I have with the plants. I basically want to know every one I see, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mushrooms out there, just to be clear. And the choice ones people have probably heard of, at least some of them, the morels, the chanterelles, these are things that are famous all over the world. Similarly with the lactarius and the rusula, and we're collectively called the boletes, chicken of the woods, maitake, oysters, honey mushrooms. All of these things are things that grow all over the world, are enjoyed by people all over the world. At the same time, some of them do have some poisonous members within their groups. Basically, every single edible I can think of has a potentially poisonous lookalike with the mushrooms, just to be clear. So very important to learn both. And this one on the bottom right, dun dun dun, destroying angels type. If that didn't give you enough, it can melt your liver, right? So it is important to be humble, right? To go slow, and to not get into the Dunning-Kruger effect too, which is basically like when you don't know what you don't know, like enough to be dangerous, as some people would say, right? So this is something to really be humble about. But at the same time, people have been doing this for thousands of years. There's lots of incredible teachers, and I only put a few up there, I would say. Happy to follow up with y'all. The morels are in the middle. They can be quite small. That's my finger there for scale. And then I would just call out this incredible gig I got at the top right. Those are hen of the woods and chicken of the woods that I brought to a wedding that was a foraged wedding, a wild food wedding that they brought me in as the forager for, and would love to see more of that, right? You can imagine once that field got to their forks, that's something that they're going to remember for the rest of their life, both the wedding couple and the guests. So many great mushrooms, so little time. There are medicinal ones, of course, as well. Each one of them kind of has a little story to it. The turkey tails are by far the most common and one of the most researched, especially for fighting cancer. Reishis are actually one of the most famous, but not all that well researched, and there is really some questions about just using that term loosely for a number of species that are in the Scanoderma genus. As far as efficacy, maybe some of you have heard of chaga. That's probably the least sustainable mushroom going on the market right now. And lion's mane is one that has potentially something to apply to Parkinson's disease, which is a really hard thing that's affected me personally. Brought it into the fold to include it here because it's pretty devastating. Anybody that's interacted with that would know. Shiitakes are one of the things that we can easily cultivate, but and often are thought of just as food, but this really gets in this idea of food as medicine. And usnea is really not exactly a mushroom. The joke is that an algae and a fungi took a liking to each other. Right? So I'm glad that still gets the giggles after all these years. That's great. So there's also some things that look alike to usnea, just to be aware. It's also something that can be hard to extract the medicine from. Of course, most of these slides could be whole talks, so I do want to just say that there are a lot of details there. Although with that online class I do by donation, I mean, thousands of hours of my life I've poured into that for you to participate as you will. So that said, we'll move on. Really thinking about food preparation and even like getting ready and doing the menu for this event, it's like definitely played into that, right? If you're going to be bringing these elements in, well, one thing I would say is that a good sauce is the key to good food, right? I mean, whatever platform you have, if you have a good sauce, then it's going to be great, right? So dressings would be an example of that. But also dips are a great kind of starter way to get people on board at the potluck, at the big game, whatever it might be. Things that people are familiar with now, like bean dips and pesto and dairy types of things that you could all be incorporating wild edibles or these heirloom vegetables, or like we have this amazing mushroom pate with wild mushrooms there on offer. Sorry for you people at home on your screen or wherever you are taking in this, but we'll enjoy it for you and give a good smile. So other things would be kimchi and kraut. Definitely something very easy to make, very expensive to buy. And similarly with the teas as well, lots of different ways I would apply teas in this regard of food as medicine. And yeah, I would say all of these, a lot of them at least, could be really great business ideas, right? And reclaiming our local food shed away from, I love California, that's where I was born, but huge percentage of all of our food comes all the way from over there, and that's just not long-term going to work. So one of the upsides is we could be making this beautiful food, pestos with wine berries or pesto with edible flowers, or the spring dip that's surrounded by all the greens that went into it at home, okay? Alcohol, of course, we're very well known for alcohol in this area, Beer City, USA. There's even a whole book about Western North Carolina beer. And I didn't make all of these things. And these, of course, could be very great business opportunities, whether it's beer, cider, mead, which is a kind of wine made with honey, or wine made with other fruits, and all sorts of tinctures like they do at Red Moon Herbs. I do have Red Moon Herbs down at the bottom right there, black walnut and wormwood, one of the benchmark anti-parasitic blends of the world that we're lucky to have to be able to produce locally. I do want to mention vinegar-based drinks, though. People are familiar with alcohol, and it certainly has its place, but at the same time, it has its problems, right? And there are all of these great old-timey ways of using vinegar to do a lot of what alcohol does, whether it's making medicine or making yummy beverages. Fire cider is probably the most famous, but you have cool terms like oxymels, shrubs, and switchels that people are now starting to get into. Just mentioning a little bit about now the organizations. This is kind of the big national, international level, the American Botanical Council and Sustainable Herbs Program. Incredible online opportunities to learn about some of these issues. CITES is the Convention on Trade of Endangered Species, and some of our native benchmark plants. Ginseng golden seal are on there, right? Venus flytrap being another one. 800 total, but out of the medicinal ones, but there's tens of thousands of medicinal plants. A lot of them haven't even really been assessed. Fair Trade and Fair Wild are some of these certification organizations, so that if it is coming from the field that you don't know, then you can have faith in these organizations that are certifying that it's done in a sustainable way. IUCN is actually where I just was. The International Union for Conservation of Nature. When you hear this plant is rare or this animal is rare, these are the people that make the red list that put those plants into those categories. And there's a medicinal plant specialist group that United Plant Savers, bottom right, is part of, and me being on the board, that's why I was there. iNaturalist, incredible resource for seeing what is where all over the country and other countries. NatureServe being a nonprofit organization that is really monitoring the most rare things of all the different states in the US. Of course, people are familiar with things like rainforest or shade-grown certified, as well as organic. And Traffic is another great organization that's monitoring the wildlife trade out there internationally. But to bring it locally, I've mentioned cooperative extension a little bit already, but bears mentioning, be aware of them as an incredible resource if you're not. Every state has one, and they basically get the researched information from the ag universities out to the public. And then you have the farmer type advocacy organizations like the Farm Worker Advocacy Network, Student Action with Farm Workers. These are ones that are near and dear to my heart, because if we're talking about the field and what's bringing it to the fork, it's mostly brown people, right? It's mostly Latino people, represents si se puede, me gusta su cultura mucho. And I walk in all these circles where those folks aren't at the table, right? And I say if you don't have a seat at the table, then you are maybe part of the meal, right? And so this is something that we really need to change. We are a huge ag state, and the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association is a nonprofit I've been part of for decades that's really trying to move that needle in a sustainable way. As far as local stuff goes, we've got ASAP is just such a rock star. A lot of people would be familiar with the 1,000 Smile Fresher stickers. They have the Appalachian Grown certification for local food, helped with a lot of the farmers markets, local food guide. They're in the schools, lots of grant funding, super amazing. If you're not aware of them and you're into this subject, then you need to be. Other local organizations, some of which are here, like Greenworks, Bountiful Cities, but also the Organic Grower School, Patchwork Urban Farms, Slow Food, and the Asheville Buncombe Food Policy Council, being some examples of good people doing good work in this area. And then on the ground, the fields as they were, right? There's over 30 community gardens just in our little town. These are some of the ones that came to mind that I wanted to share with you. Oftentimes they are in disadvantaged communities as well, so all the more important to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables in places where they might not be as common, but also figuring out things to do with those is pretty important too. But the conclusion here is that the concept of field to fork depends on a multitude of interlocking pieces: consumers, people in the field, educators, advocates, all of it. Asheville, I will say, is an incredible model for this, for our whole region, country, and even, I would say, the world. Having just come back from France, which is certainly known for its food culture, more than most, I would put us right there with them. And finding your place in the mix, I'm so glad y'all came out here. Food is fundamental, right after air and water, right? Basic needs, Maslow's hierarchy, right? Another great thing to learn if you're not familiar. And we need people like you in the crowd, people like you on your screen. Everybody, let's raise up, let's do some good work. Thank you.
thank you all for coming. We're going to not have any questions at the moment. We're just going to adjourn, and you can enjoy. I do want to give a shout out, because Marc mentioned the menu. We've been planning this menu for 2 years, actually. And so just to say, the service berry dressing, a good sauce, is from service berries collected on campus. The mushrooms are also local. The pawpaws, made by the hop. I'm trying to think of, and the quiche. So we have three to four campus gardens. So the ingredients were harvested from the campus gardens. So everything's still out there. If you want to take some as you go, please feel free. Talk to the community organizations. Marc will be around. So again, thank you all so much for coming. Have a good day.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I kept it to 50 minutes.
You did.
Right?
It was perfect.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.